Warning, there will be flashing fashion images in this video. If you are sensitive to that, please do not watch. Turn away. Hey, I'm Ryan. Today I wanted to make a video about how we transitioned from the 2020 era of flashing images across the screen in these fast-paced short TikToks with no context, no citations, no sources of the images, just these amalgamations of images that created these aesthetics, which led to people asking, like, what is this called? What culture is this? Where are these pictures from? What do I look for on Pinterest to find this? And then what do I search for as far as keywords in stores to buy this? How do I get this look? What is this all about? And the intrigue and interest that these aesthetic groupings sparked, and how I think that that's left us with some degree of fatigue, which I think is also connected to the status ambiguity that I've been talking about. This is like coolness ambiguity and cultural ambiguity and fashion ambiguity. And I think it's led to people trying to organize, and that has led to fatigue. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, and I hope you guys like it. I saw conversations online that sparked me to make a TikTok about how we went from the complaining about gatekeeping industrial complex and transitioned directly into the complaining about everything being organized and labeled industrial complex in the fashion space online, and it's interesting to me. So during the lockdown of 2020, I noticed that a lot of spaces were carved out online on TikTok specifically, but also in other spaces of the internet, like high fashion Twitter started growing, and Tumblr resurged for like very niche, like really cool interests. There is an especially large growth attached to exclusive subcultural interests, especially ones that would be considered cool and otherwise inaccessible. Like I ended up somehow on like nightlife tattooing, like cool underground Australian TikTok. There is also the growth of the archive fashion space. We're using archive fashion to refer to the way that the people labeled it at the time. In reality, we know that anything technically can be archived, especially in the fashion space, but when I say archive fashion in this context, it refers to a specific image or grouping of images and aesthetic of images from the past that were documented mostly on Instagram pages, and they would involve dystopian looking fashion, tech and outdoor gear, ragged knitwear, anti-fashion designers, the Antwerp Six, etc. And they would be referred to as archive Instagram pages. But when that aesthetic and those kinds of images were put to Pinterest and then shared on TikTok, people labeled those styles of images quote unquote archive fashion, even though anything, again, can be archived, and fashion that is old can look and appear in any way. They used it to describe the fashion of designers like Yohji Yamamoto, Raf Simons, CCP, Rick Owens, Andy Meester, etc., etc. Graphic design, TikTok, and these spaces grew and grew over time, except for the Australian like cool nightlife scene. The cooler niches existed safely on TikTok though, because TikTok was not so popular of an app, especially not with the age demographic of like cool young people. Does that make sense? So TikTok started out as a short form video content platform after it was Musical.ly, which drew a lot of young children to the app, and it was known for being a kids app for lip syncing, and then it developed into still mostly a kids app for content creation, usually comedic and lifestyle based content creation. So the audience of users in general was like younger and more disconnected from those kinds of scenes, so they either didn't care or had no impact or influence on, like, if they did see a video like that, they could just be an audience member and nothing really else. They weren't going to write an article about those underground scenes or do anything about it. And it's kind of like the way that all apps are at first that are viable for the public. Cool people go there first and start doing weird things, or weird people go there first and start doing weird things. And so you always have like mostly weird people who are brave and risky enough to put themselves out there. Like think of the inception of YouTube. Like really early YouTube was just like weird weirdos who do skits and want to be actors and things like that, who are just putting themselves out there because they wanted a voice or attention or, you know, jobs that they couldn't otherwise get. And so they were brave enough to put themselves out there on this new platform, just like, I'll put myself out anywhere. And then also like really cool like underground people who were like, this is only a weird place for weird people. I can put myself out here too, because with my niche underground subcultural interest, because no one who knows me is going to find me because nobody uses this platform. Then as they grow, the audience shifts and the demographic of creators shift. Like as YouTube has grown, people found out it was an actual like very commercially viable place and you can make it into a job. So the kind of people creating content changes and the kind of audience changes with them, etc. And that's kind of how TikTok was. It's like the inception of Vine as well. Vine, different from YouTube in that it was like much cooler because we already had the preface of YouTube, right? Vine had that same thing though. Weird people and little kids making like comedy weird videos of like just disturbing like nonsense Dadaist like content, and then also like really cool quote unquote people would be on Vine as well, who were like funny and able to build entire like livelihoods off of that platform, like Nick Coletti, for example. So TikTok had the same thing. It was a way of hiding in plain sight on like what was considered a new app. TikTok is formerly Musical.ly, which was a children's lip syncing app. And people in that age demographic weren't as often engaging, and when they were generally watching like the comedy content or the personality centered content that was that TikTok was known for at that time. Very similar to Vine at the time. And you were seeing videos from complete strangers. The format was also different on TikTok. There were shorter form videos, like 10 seconds, I believe, 10 to 15, and then 1 minute, and then we got 3-minute videos and then 10-minute videos. And back then it was just pretty much exclusively short form content. So it was similar to the beginnings of Vine or YouTube. People were just putting up clips. They weren't thinking like, let me make content, as much as they were like, let me just put this thing out there. And so it was really easy at that time to carve out a niche for high fashion spaces, or carve out niche. It was really easy at that time to carve out niche high fashion spaces on that platform. You could easily express yourself online and not be found out by your peers, unlike most connected social media platforms, where you're on Instagram with your friends from middle school and high school that you've grown up with and that you maybe don't talk to anymore, your past coworkers, people who have asked you on dates and you don't want to give them your phone number, girls who you met in the club bathroom, you know what I mean? People who you could feel embarrassed by putting yourself out there too. And there's a lot more pressure on other social media platforms for some people. That's the way that they internalize it. TikTok was unlike that. You weren't very likely to run into somebody that you knew on there, it felt like. And if you did, it kind of like wouldn't really matter. I would also argue that the anonymity and exclusivity of TikTok, because it was this embarrassing place to exist for little kids or wannabe comedians, wannabe actors putting their work up, and also just random people on the internet sharing about their everyday mundane lives or comedic experiences in this slice of life kind of way. It made it so that people felt that they could assert authority in a way that they may not have ever experienced in the past online, because they hadn't interacted with any new platforms as they were growing and developing. Most people who want to be content creators now were not able to capitalize on that at the inception of Instagram, YouTube, etc., because these things were all new concepts as a result of those platforms. But now that we've had experience with those platforms for so many years, people who want to have social status online or build communities with other people who have similar interests online and possibly be leaders in those communities, or just generally branch out with authority, they were like, finally, this is my time to shine. I have a space where I can share these kinds of images when they couldn't otherwise, for example, build an archive fashion Instagram page because they didn't feel like they had the authority. They wouldn't necessarily know where to get the pictures, etc., etc. But they know if they lift those pictures from Instagram, Pinterest, Tumblr, etc., and place them on this new platform of TikTok where there isn't already a community that's strong and built up around these interests, that they could possibly be like one of the first voices in these spaces, or just generally build community with people who may also be scared to branch out, you know, similarly. So you follow the archive Instagram pages, but so do 100,000 other people. You're like, I'm coming to TikTok with pictures like this to see if there are other people who are similar followers of those pages who want to be friends with me or talk to me about fashion, but we may not be the foremost experts in this field. And now there's no pressure for us to be, because we're in this new online space, this new landscape. And because of this freedom, this kind of world began growing on fashion TikTok, what later became fashion TikTok. So there were these niche 90s to early 2000s high fashion spaces that started developing. And the most common way that this would develop, that was like expanded upon and shaped the rest of the fashion history on that platform, was these like fast-paced, like 6 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, flickering slideshows. They were dominating, and it would be like Sean Ellis or Nick Knight photos, Corinne Day photo shoots. Japanese fashion was huge, Fruits Mag pictures that people had never seen before. If they hadn't been in the online fashion space in the past, they were like, what is this? They're seeing Miu Miu runways from the 90s and early 2000s. They're seeing Prada runways for the first time, Hysteric Glamour, Yohji Yamamoto, Comme des Garçons, Issey Miyake, CCP, Guidi. They're like, what are these brands? Why do the people wearing them look so cool? And these photo shoots look so subversive and different and outside of what's going on in the mainstream. When I'm on this like mainstream app that's just for, you know, seeing weird, funny content that everybody can relate to. What is with this like anti-fashion like imagery? What is this? It was very, very profound for a lot of people to engage these images for the first time, which is what I imagine it was like for people on Tumblr in the 2010s as well. Like that's why it was such an enchanting platform for like me and all my mutuals and fellow people, like anybody interested in fashion in the 2010s. If you hadn't engaged those high fashion images, and even if you had, like the broad depth of images you would be presented with on Tumblr, it was just so enchanting. You're like locked in mentally. There's not much context, not much information on Tumblr. You see the picture, maybe the source link, and it's one word. It'll be like Flickr, and then you click on the Flickr if you care. And you're just pulled into these worlds, these decontextualized worlds. And that's exactly what you would see on TikTok with like a drum and bass song in the background, or a song from the 90s or early 2000s that's like obscure or was a radio song back then but doesn't have much popularity now and didn't really exist in the cultural zeitgeist in 2020 or late 2019. And people who were born in the 2000s are like, what is this music? You know, they may have never heard it or heard it once or twice when they were 1 or 2 years old, very young. And so it was this super engaging platform. Why did I repeat engaging? But this was just like a really super engaging platform for a lot of people. It's like being brought into a new world. I think the emphasis that I want to place is on the fact that there was no context for these images. No context. Picture. Flash. I'll try to use examples because I swear I should have some pictures downloaded or some videos downloaded from this time, because I was going to make content about this. I was going to make write-ups about this at the time. So I should have some examples. But yeah, you might see 20 images within a 10 or 15 second time frame with this loud like experimental music in the background, or Sophie or Arca or drum and bass or garage, like really cool music, or like Stereo Lab and things like that, and you're just like, whoa, where am I? And you don't even have time to necessarily process all the details of all the photos. You're more catching a vibe, like, you know what I mean? It's like vibe culture, like I always reference. I know it sounds funny, and I am kind of being funny, but it really was like, you really could only catch a vibe. You can't really interpret all of the details in the images because of how quickly they flash on the screen. So a lot of those videos would be downloaded and people would screenshot the pictures after they've downloaded it. But yeah, you're just mostly presented with a larger context that you're supposed to interpret and digest. So the space was maintained by consistent updating and enhancing of the obscurity of the images as well. So once it got too popular to reference like any specific Japanese magazine, like Fruits, for example, then people would shift into, you know, CCP pictures from Tumblr, or Rick Owens runway pictures from the past, or from a not menswear show that people weren't already posting a ton. And they would always adapt these videos to become more and more obscure Gap ads. Like who thought that in a subversive, like anti-fashion context, people would do a mainstream company like Gap? And it's like including them in this context creates like this level of trend adaptation that's alienating in that way, that brings more people in, ironically. Diverse, heterogeneous environment of fashion images that all speak to a larger sensibility, rather than being like, you can only do this. Like there weren't so many rules, and that's what would construct these, like that would construct the meaning and storytelling of these series of images. That's what would tether them, the fact that the person chose to organize them together and create meaning of them together next to each other, including with the music, including with the context of their account. Many of these accounts would be nameless, completely anonymous, exist only under a username, no information about their age, location, gender, or lack thereof, identity, no first name, just like a cool username that references the fact that these pictures are old and nostalgic from the 90s, archival images, high fashion usernames, etc., or like musician usernames, ironic usernames and things like that. And they had no context. The pictures and videos had no context. The music, they wouldn't really explain what it was. Sometimes you would click on the sound on TikTok and you still wouldn't get any more information about identifying the music that you're listening to, because it would be fast-paced remixes and slowed down and like chopped and screwed to the point that it couldn't be interpreted by the auto-detecting software and things like that. It was just completely like decontextualized. So yeah, I wrote that they would find runway images from the 80s that were obscure from a fashion designer that most people couldn't find because they weren't on Vogue Runway, for example. The next week they'd post like November 2047 and Ishi and CCP, obscure designers that have only shown a couple of collections. Maybe they'll do an Anklo flashing screenshot, and then like 90s photography and things like that, old advertisements, and they would be side by side with each other, creating these aesthetic groupings and these what people called niche micro aesthetics. So the meaning, again, was constructed by the entirety of that. So the way that the accounts looked, the way that their feed looked, the way that their videos looked, the music in the background, their username, their anonymity, etc., and the kinds of people that were engaged in the video, all of that created the meaning behind these aesthetic groupings and groups. So the summary of this is that this happened as a result of the popularity of the app Pinterest. To me, that's my belief, where people were sourcing images from, and they were sourcing images from Pinterest. Pinterest sources images from other platforms like Tumblr, fashion forums, runway sites, blog spots, etc. But very often the pictures in this context were from different Tumblr blogs and other high fashion sources online, and they would organize those images for the users into these algorithmically organized boxes, essentially, that would, you know, create and reinforce and maintain these micro aesthetics. And for many people, like I said, it was their first time seeing images like this in general, but especially when these images were grouped together, especially in these high fashion contexts. So it's not just like the typical like cool photography type of thing. They're seeing high fashion advertisements, editorials from the 90s, from the early 2000s that were really challenging and subversive at that time, and have been like our media at this time is completely different. So the media that they've grown up with in adolescence is the opposite of that, because it's a response to that time. So it's very challenging for a lot of people to see images. Like if you've grown up in the authentic marketing era of like diversity and inclusion and things like that, and then you're seeing these like problematic looking advertisements, high glam looking advertisements, and things like that, and editorials and things, you're like, whoa, what is this? Or if you're seeing anti-fashion and you've grown up wearing like, you know, typically aspirational fashion or streetwear, you're like, whoa, what is this, maybe, you know? Or mainstream interpretations of streetwear, I should say. And because of that, and because of these niche areas of fashion that were brought to people, these niche areas of fashion came with an inherent exclusivity, and people immediately identified that and wanted in. People wanted to buy their way into this exclusivity and status signaling. And I talk a lot about status signaling on this account. think about people's first time interpreting like these ultra exclusive, like kind of snooty fashion images of the time, and then trying to bring it to an audience who never engaged those images unless they happened to also be interested in fashion. They didn't grow up during the 90s and early 2000s. They didn't see these images and advertisements and editorials in magazines. And so they're like, I'm 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I can bring these images to people my age and use them to adapt the trends that we have now in this way that signals so much status. It's era-based trend interpretation, it's trend adaptation, it's high fashion, it's super exclusive, and people wanted in literally with so much immediacy. They were like, I have to have my hands on this stuff. They wanted the coolness and the exclusivity and status associated with what they saw in the images, not just the literal items. Like, as compelling as the designs were at that time, it's not the designs, it's the status, like, frankly, that people felt compelled by. And it was clear in those images and in these online contexts that relied so heavily on anonymity. People knew what they were buying into. They were like, this is cool. They were not unaware of how cool these things were. So yeah, people found the exclusivity aspirational, and they were gaining insight into an enchanting covert world of fashion for the first time. It was like getting an access to a how to be cool manual, essentially, for a lot of people. And I'm gonna stop right here to say, I don't personally attach signs of morality, good or bad, this is how it is, or how it shouldn't be, and this shouldn't be this way, and da-da-da. When I talk about like people trying to adopt coolness and status signal in these ways, I don't care, and it isn't weird or confusing to me at all to see young people wanting to be cool. And when I see people who are in their 20s and older being like, well, I don't really care about being cool because I am so secure in myself that I don't even care about being cool. I think when you actually are secure in yourself, you understand why people want to signal status, and you don't really care when somebody is explaining it from a sociological perspective. Like, I don't think people are bad people for wanting to buy into these aesthetics. I completely understand why people want to buy into these aesthetics, and regardless, I'm not talking about it based on like they're good people for doing that, they're so smart, they're great, or they're bad people, they're posers, they're losers. Whether they're posers and losers or great people, you know, in the movie Jennifer Body, where the cool dude, or if you're a, it doesn't really matter to me in this analysis. It just matters that that's what happened, you know? Whether you're a cool dude or you're, this is how it happened. So just getting back to it, I really am like, I thank God I never get comments like this on YouTube, but on TikTok, when I talk about like people trying to be cool or like the concept of coolness, people are like, well, I don't really care about coolness and nobody should care about coolness. It doesn't really matter if you say that, because we do know that coolness is a driving factor, quote unquote, coolness is a driving factor in like millions and hundreds of millions of dollars circulating throughout the world and throughout the fashion industry. So like this idea that like, oh, I just don't care about that, like, okay, but a lot of people do, and businesses do, and businesses make money and people profit off of it. And so when we're analyzing fashion, I do think it's a considerable like aspect of it. I don't think it's weird at all to think about it. People were seeing adaptations of trends that they had never seen before in general, but especially in such plurality and depth. So you're not just seeing the trend, like this fleeting image of the trend without like any context or history or other associated images. You are seeing this trend, and then that this is a trend that comes from this high fashion designer, and that it was also adapted in this different way at that time, and it's from like the 90s or early 2000s vaguely and broadly to you. And then like there's this like kind of car that goes with it, and then there's this kind of music that goes with it, these kinds of accessories and this kind of furniture and home design that goes with it, and it's like an intellectual artist movement. So there's like philosophy and books that go with it. Like, you're like, this is broad, this is my kind of thing. People are getting into it and believing like these are the kinds of people I've always wanted to align with, and that's what I think was also really compelling about it. So they're getting like this instructional manual of what to buy and how to look subversive and alienate other people from participating in this kind of thing through like their access and entrance to it via fashion TikTok, these niche spaces in fashion TikTok. So the guide is like how to construct a subversive fashion identity via TikTok, complete with people who are like 30 or 27, 28, 29, who are interested in fashion and have always been interested in fashion and grew up in that fashion space as well. explaining exactly how to properly adapt your fashion trends to look more subversive and correctly represent them, how to properly signal status with authenticity, etc. Like, this is a gold mine for people, especially younger people or young adults who have always wanted to be able to participate in fashion in this way and specifically signal status in this like cool girl subversive way. They are getting information on how to adapt the trends, how to represent era-based trends in a more effective, exclusive, quote-unquote cool way to signal status and alienate the mainstream trend followers. And so it stops being this small exclusive space online. As the fashion space on TikTok grows, the platform starts incentivizing fashion creators specifically, bringing them to Fashion Week, etc., and bringing them to fashion-based events. So as the app grows in general, rising to become the most downloaded app, this becomes like a massive space online. These aesthetics become ubiquitous and the conversations become ubiquitous. So you're getting these flashing decontextualized videos, right? Late 2019, early 2020, especially during the lockdown of the pandemic. I would say this starts in 2020 pretty much. Then you're getting maybe a couple of people doing videos where they're talking about it. So you're getting people writing the articles about and interpreting indie sleaze, ballet core, 90s fashion, Y2K, early 2000s fashion, true thousands fashion, explaining the histories behind designer fashion brands, which becomes an extremely trendy way of making content. Must know cool furniture design and interior design artists, contemporary art, history, philosophy, politic, etc., etc. So you're getting more and more information about these things, and it's developing and developing and developing until it's about to burst. So this movement happens, taking us a step back. The movement happened and it became ubiquitous because it starts off as this niche underground place for cool people, and then more and more people start learning about it, and you have like very young teenagers into like 20 somethings creating these decontextualized videos with Pinterest images, in part because you have these fashion experts on this platform, like people who are very knowledgeable about Helmut Lang, Japanese fashion, anti-fashion, global fashion histories, Rei Kawakubo, Martin Margiela, Rick Owens. As the interest in these brands are growing and these people are asserting status as fashion experts and agenda setters in the fashion space. So these very, very knowledgeable people are like, well, I have nowhere else to share my information. Nobody really listens to anybody on TikTok, and I won't be embarrassed to make content on there for my friend in front of my friends. So I'm just going to share what I think on there, build a platform, or like not even build a platform, just like share this weird niche thing I'm interested in case anybody else who's interested in it can find me. And then young people are like, oh, this is a person with authority speaking on this. Let's listen. And so they start teaching them or referencing briefly how to collect these fashion pieces, referencing things like Japanese proxy servers. People start learning how to and sharing information about how to obtain these fashion pieces on eBay, The RealReal. People start learning about hysteric glamour, wild and lethal trash, Walter von Behrendonck, Japanese like baby clothes and how to get them and allow them to look like that kind of fashion, and Fruits Mag thing. People start learning about subversive designers and challenging designers, November 2047, Undercover, Comme des Garçons, Issey Miyake, Yohji Yamamoto, Rick Owens, Andy Meester. People start learning about the Antwerp Six and mentioning the Antwerp Six. People start talking about subversive specific designs, Margiela Tabi's, CCP, Guidi, etc., Comme des Garçons, Tao, the different designers at Comme des Garçons, the different designers at Issey Miyake, and people are doing everything they can to adapt, adjust until they are further and further into obscurity in this small but growing fashion space. But it starts growing and growing and growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger. Keep in mind, we've just left the post-Supreme transition into Rick Owens industrial, our quote-unquote archive fashion industrial complex, where people are following these archive fashion Instagram pages, and then moving that kind of fashion over to TikTok, etc., etc. So you have these people following YouTubers who are teaching them about these high fashion brands after the streetwear fashion, you know, trend, and then they're moving into this small space on TikTok, and it just explodes. And I wouldn't say it explodes as in 100% of the population is wearing this, or if you're in a small town in Iowa, everybody's walking around in hysteric glamour. That's not what I believe, but I do believe in the online fashion space. It did become ubiquitous for people to the extent that they wanted to shift trends or started experiencing fatigue and exhaustion. It becomes a trending video format for people to make these flickering image after image after image Pinterest photo videos, right? It becomes a trending way of making videos it becomes a trending video format for people to start educating about these older brands or contemporary artists or design movements or interior designers or specific furniture pieces that they see in these subversive art and fashion conversations online, right? My belief is the outcome is people wanted information about these things. They demanded information. And I'm saying that as someone who has consulted with people directly who were there in 2020 creating very niche content about like specifically Japanese fashion designers more than anything, and these high fashion designers. People wanted information. They wanted people to not gatekeep these aesthetics. They wanted people to not gatekeep these brands. There were so many questions about how do you learn about fashion? How do you learn about these designers? What are these designers called? What does it mean? How do you look up what this aesthetic looks like so that you can learn more information about it or buy brands that look like this or find out how to be like this and perform this look? Right? They needed information so that they could buy into it and opt into it. Like I said earlier, it was so aspirational. People wanted anything that they could do to get their hands on this aesthetic and be a part of it and benefit from the aspirational nature of its exclusivity. And the reason why it had this level of aspirational exclusivity is in part because of gatekeeping, whether intentional or not. Like gatekeeping in exclusive fashion communities, and people wanted in. But it came from the fact that people had these exclusive communities. Now, I think that this can happen naturally and occur naturally because these are subversive fashion styles. Like they literally go against what goes on in the mainstream. So you would have to be interested in fashion and then interested in this kind of fashion and agree with what they're doing to challenge the mainstream of fashion. As someone who's seen these fashion styles online for like 20 years, there are people who will never care about those brands that I've just mentioned or any of those kinds of aesthetics, and they know a ton about fashion. They love and appreciate fashion. It is not for them. So you would have to be someone who knows about fashion in the first place, meaning you have an interest in mainstream fashion, high fashion, and then you're getting into subversive fashion, anti-fashion, and then you have to like these specific designers. It wasn't a universal thing in general to like this area of fashion. It was already a niche within the fashion community, right? It was inaccessible because of that. But also it was inaccessible in part because these communities, for some of these designers, have like their cult followings. They have the desire to maintain the integrity of the meaning of these fashion brands. And they understand that with the way that fashion operates, no matter what you say, no matter what any of us say or believe about how everybody should just be themselves, it shouldn't matter to you if other people are wearing what you're wearing, that is not how fashion operates. Fashion operates, and I've explained it before, you have the initial trigger and then you have it becoming disseminated and then you have something that's an obstacle that stops it and then it changes and transforms and you have this new initial trigger. That is how fashion goes in and out of style. Something has to stop it. It has to hit an obstacle, and once something becomes ubiquitous and universal, that is usually the obstacle. You know, once it's canceled or problematic, or once it becomes ubiquitous and universal because it loses its original meaning, what's it's originally associated with. And when people are trying to emulate that original source, it doesn't have the same meaning as people who are originally doing it in order to communicate and stand up against something. And I do understand that it can be painful for people to believe that, but I do think it is the case that once it becomes ubiquitous, people feel like it loses its meaning. So people started once it became more and more popular and more universal for people to start adopting this fashion style or participating in engaging it, people wanted more information about how to organize information around this so that they could better understand it, so that they could better participate in it. They needed to know what brands were in the picture so that they could obtain the brands for themselves. They needed to know how to buy them and where to buy them. They needed to know what these aesthetics were labeled so that they could search online in the search fields for keywords on Pinterest, on Tumblr, for more images like that so they could get more inspiration and engage more of these fashion images, but also so they could search on keywords on Depop, on Poshmark, on Grailed, in the secondhand market, on eBay, on Japanese proxy servers, Japanese Yahoo auction, etc. And also what other websites they could use that weren't as visible and popular to them, so that they could know where to get these clothes, and also again so that they could adapt and get the most obscure versions of these clothes that not everybody has access to, in order to again assert status and create this individuality for themselves as a fashion identity in comparison to their peers. Yes, you may know Rick Owens, but you don't have this older Rick Owens piece. Yes, you may know Rick Owens, but you don't necessarily know Undercover. Yes, you may know Rick Owens, but you don't know that you don't wear insert styles that are more popular and universal, or that are more known about, etc., etc. People wanted to be able to create distance between themselves and other people in order to reinforce meaning about the ways that they fashion identity, which I've talked about several times in the past, so you get it, right? And because of that, like I said, the more people are searching, the more search engine optimization increases, the platforms and algorithms start paying attention, people start developing content about it, the fashion space starts growing and growing, people start engaging content about it, which reinforces the cycle of its growing, which means that on platforms, when you're doing searches for these things, you are getting more specific, more correct images of what you're searching for, and everything kind of just bubbles up to the surface and it becomes everywhere. One of the outcomes was, like I mentioned earlier, people complained a ton about the concept of niche microaesthetics. A lot of people would say, you don't have to label these things. I just saw a really good tweet. I wish I could see it, but my phone's dead. But I saw a really good tweet I'll put on the screen about like core, and like everything does not have to be a core, and not everything is so simple as being boxed into a core, and that there's nuance in our reality. And that is very true. But it is the case that when you're searching online for keywords in the search bar in order to buy your way into something, or participate in, or work to understand or learn something, the format of the way that websites are created, like because of the literal layout of a website, you're encouraged to box things in so that you can search for them. And you can find more accurate representations of what you're looking for, or broader representations of what you're looking for, but you have to have some keywords. And that's what encouraged people to want to box things in part, so that they could find them. Right? And that's just literally the physical user experience of websites. You do have to know what you're looking for to type it into the field. I did find that a lot of people felt uncomfortable with things like the commodifying of the aesthetics in order to sell knockoffs and mass-produced products that are based on these images. That were produced unethically because of the vast interest in them. I also found a lot of people concerned with the idea that like everyone is a trend forecaster, which comes from people feeling uncomfortable with the authority to talk about these concepts and trace them back to different subcultural identities. I found that people expressed concern about the raising prices of high fashion on the secondhand market on platforms that I mentioned earlier. People complain about these aesthetics becoming too universal too quickly, and thus not allowing for people to meaningfully participate in them with any longevity, which is connected to sustainability, which was a really massive area of concern for people. People were upset, or people were concerned that the aesthetics were being, like, they would just immediately become uncool because of how universal they were. People were feeling fatigue and wanted the slowing down of this broad spectrum of microaesthetics. Alex Hildreth describes the condition as like paralytic fear that people have, based on my video about this that I initially posted on TikTok, that people felt like they couldn't, I've expressed that I felt like people thought that they couldn't even begin to participate in a trend because it would become too universal too quickly. They were concerned that it would have an article written about it immediately, which would cause people to fear that people would doubt their authenticity in participating in any kind of trend, their authenticity, their connection to the trend, their reason for participating in fashion, their authenticity in general outside of the trend as a fashionable person, it just creates a lot of fear and stops people from moving. I feel like when we were in 2020, all throughout the year, and even towards the beginning and kind of middle of 2021, I think people felt more freedom and excitement to participate in these quote-unquote niche microaesthetics and anticipating the next one, until there started becoming a massive amount of discourse online circulating around each aesthetic, the concept of niche microaesthetics, the concept of how people respond to and create discourse around the aesthetics, the discourse about the discourse about the discourse. And I do agree with Alex Holdred's wording of paralytic fear. It literally stopped people from being able to want to participate in them. And you'll notice that the articles have slowed down, because it would be this week there's 3 new microaesthetics and 4 new the next week and 2 new the next week. And now it's literally just like, we're waiting, like, what's next? And it's not that we've exhausted all of the aesthetics that exist, which I do think we kind of have exhausted a lot of them because of the fast-paced nature of these things turning over, because of how universal they became, and because of all the exhausting discourse. But I think beyond that, it's just that people are scared to have association with these kinds of things, the exhaustive discourse. They're scared to share their fashion online and have people creating discourse or questioning their authenticity or questioning, their ability to participate in these things. And I would argue that the people who are able to still comfortably participate in niche microaesthetics are those who refuse to have their aesthetics labeled. Any aesthetic that I can think of that does not have an article written up about it on a major publication, those are the ones that are still thriving. The participants are able to freely express themselves without having their legitimacy and authenticity in participating in fashion or those aesthetics called into question or checked. And I think that comes from the fact that they are not explained. So even though they're in plain sight, the source of these aesthetics and the labeling and explanations of where these aesthetics come from, the subcultures that built them up and that people have contributed to, are still gate-kept. And that's what allows people to participate in them in a way that is different than someone doing bloquette, blokecore, ladcore, ballet core, indie sleaze, ballet sleaze, etc., etc. Those people have their legitimacy called into question, their aesthetic called into question, the discourse, the exhaustive discourse about it online constantly that can be inhibiting to people and instill this paralytic fear in them. The people who are just like vibing and wearing clothes and also completely like distancing themselves from the concept of discourse about their aesthetics, they're able to maintain the integrity of their aesthetics, and they don't seem to be fatigued in the same way as other people with the labeled and explained niche macro aesthetics, because they are still gatekeeping them. And like I explained about Jesse MP3, OGBFF, Luke Blovad, Aaliyah's Interlude, and people like that, like having more fun and having camp participation in the way that they construct an outward identity, divesting from the intention of even intellectualizing your aesthetic, like meaning pulling away from the concept of even thinking about being like, well, this actually comes from this and it's so deep and the real true reason why we dress like this is this. When people are just like, actually, I'm just doing this because it's fun and it's a vibe, though, that like forward moving like area of fashion is the only thing that's continuing to prevail, in my opinion, without this anxiety. And it comes from the fact that like the exhaustive discourse is only going to exhaust the aesthetics as well. Once the discourse starts, the aesthetic can only last so long, and then it dies out because people are exhausted of thinking about it, and it makes it feel like we've experienced it for much longer than we have, and it creates this level of fatigue that I don't think people who are just participating in niche microaesthetics that they refuse to explain and refuse to talk to journalists about, I don't think that they feel the same thing, and I think that's really smart of them. And that's why, no matter where we are, everyone is all connected. Like, literally, this connects to every concept I've said before in my past videos, which I think is really funny. Okay. My prediction is that this caused people to move toward independent designers. I think it sparked people's interest in independent designers and lesser known contemporary designers than these massive high fashion houses that tons of information was circulating about. And I use the examples, I think Shushu Tong, Kiko Kostanov, Sandy Lang, Dilara Findikoglu, Chopova Luena, Simone Rocha, I think several other ones I could name. I think brands like this have success with that same demographic that was interested in this kind of fashion in the first place, and also just general fashion girlies who are tapping more in because of TikTok's hype around fashion. I think brands like this have success now and have tons of eyes and interest on them. Heaven by Marc Jacobs as well, but we'll talk about that later. There's tons of eyes on them, and I think it comes from the exhaustive relationship people have with the quote-unquote archive fashion culture and those brands. Like, my expectation was, if we are able to take this slowly, people are going to get really interested into the histories of these brands, and they're going to be doing their own individual research and learn how to authenticate these brands on the secondhand market, and they're going to slowly buy all these pieces up, and everybody's going to be a slow collector based on whatever thing they actually like. But what actually happened was, it seemed like people tried as quickly as they could to buy up everything that they heard about, like Margiela Tabis on the secondhand market, any brands that they thought were really cool, that excited them. They bought up everything that they could at the time, like when it first started, 2020s, early 2021 at latest. And then once the prices started growing on the secondhand market, it made it so that people felt like, why should I invest time in learning how to authenticate on the secondhand market, question if my items are authentic, learn and research all these things, when I can participate in fashion right now? And there is fashion that's happening right now, which I think also brought people toward other like elite brands like La Mer, The Row, and similar brands, so that they could participate in fashion right now and build knowledge about fashion that's also happening without having their authenticity checked, and also adapt the trend of participating in these high fashion brands and kind of alienate people who are just interested in the fashion that coincidentally happened to get really popular on TikTok, while asserting status as someone who's fashionable and knowledgeable about fashion. They're like, okay, well, you guys all know about those brands and their archival like legacies and things like that, but I know about this really cool fashion brand that's popping and popular right now, and I'm doing research to learn about it because they only have like a 10, 15, 20 year history or whatever, and it's really easy to learn about. And also, even if it isn't, there are less people who are interested in and know about it, so nobody's going to authentic check me or fact check me on these brands. Not to say that that's why people learn. I'm just saying it's interesting to these people in general because these are great brands, but also I think it's a cool place for people to be like, you guys are over there like fighting about who knows the most and who, you know, has liked this longer and who's the real fan of this brand, and I'm over here just like being able to participate in fashion in this exciting way also with these newer brands, and getting to know and build relationships with these newer brands, and the garments that they're creating, which are exciting and may be like, maybe I can connect these to those historical brands, right, that people are talking about in this fashion space. So they're like, okay, well, this brand is similar to this brand that everybody's like fighting and yelling about on fashion TikTok and creating discourse around. And so you can even connect them without having to be like in this more volatile, you know, possible online relationship with fashion. So they're also doing this with like revival brands and brands that have had that same like popularity as far as like legacy of their houses in the like archive fashion, chronically online fashion discourse world, like Diesel, Prada, Miu Miu, Blue Marine, and then like Heaven by Marc Jacobs being this kind of like having this place in the zeitgeist. They're able to participate in these revival brands. Like, they don't have to necessarily know the whole history of Blue Marine and be like, oh, I'm gonna get authentic checked on Blue Marine. They're like, well, I love Blue Marine slays, and they're having their comeback moment right now, and this is my brand that I'm attaching to now. Rather than being like, well, I know the history of every single brand and da-da-da-da. They're like, well, I'm participating in what's going on right now, which is also really cool. I think both sides are really cool. So people care about the brands and their legacies, and they come back and invest in learning about the brand's legacies without having to invest their entire life in knowing all the history, because they're centered on what's going on right now. So people are also searching for underground brands and independent brands. A lot of people are searching for Black-owned brands, woman-owned brands, sustainable brands, in response, I think, to this. They're like, there's so much exhaustion and fatigue. There's article after article. There's people who are telling people they're not doing it right. There are people who are telling people the correct ways to adapt it, the incorrect ways to adapt it. There's so much exhaustion and fatigue on this side that they're just like, what's new? What's new and what's next? And I think that that's where people are going to continue to go toward. APOC Store, APOC Scene, Essence, it's just like a list of cool brands you can get into that are doing things right now that you don't have to exhaust yourself with the discourse about. And I think people are spreading out and broadening out to appreciating other brands. So these people love fashion, and they also are getting more and more interested in these subversive styles, and they want to be able to command attention from those people around them who have similar overlapping interests. I'm like, oh, slay! Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, this is just what I wanted to talk about. This is like, again, another starter video, and I'm just going to keep expanding on these concepts and connecting and linking them all together, as I always do. I feel like all of my videos are a chain link. Like, ever since I had red hair after I made the cult classic videos. All of my videos are like a chain link. It's like this chain connects to this chain, connects to this chain, connects to this chain, connects to this chain. It's not like they're all connected. You have to watch all of them. I'm just joking, but they're all connected. So yeah, I think that they all go back to something I've said before. So hopefully this one's connected to a few other ones, and hopefully this makes sense. But yeah, this is really cool and exciting for me to talk about. My biggest interest in this is that this is going to lead people toward newer brands, because they're so exhausted with these conversations about what's going on in the past. And all those brands from the past are doing things right now. Jean Paul Gaultier, Martin Margiela, Ferragamo, Chloe, all these brands have active you know, production right now. So it's really exciting to see what they're going to do next. And it means that more people are getting interested in new fashion and independent designers and ways to stand out and ways to adapt trends to make it their own in response to this experience that we've had. So I'm excited to see where fashion goes next. And I think a lot of things are pushing people toward independent and newer brands. So hopefully investors and people like that pay attention to that and put as much as they can into backing these newer brands and making sure that they have them in front of the people's faces who are interested in learning about new, different forms of fashion. Let me know what you guys think. My stomach hurts as always. I'm gonna order candy, I think.